Bobby Fischer wins the most difficult, hardest, and technically challenged game of the World Championship match by having three pawns instead of his bishop during an endgame in which pawns are worth the weight of gold. And because his position was better, he was able to convert that into a win. So this is the Alakine defense for the king's pawn opening. This is a modern variation of the Alakine defense, where the central control is for white, and white is being played by Spassky, and Fischer is playing with the black pieces. So g6 by Fischer with the intent of bringing your bishop to g7 and castling on the king's side, and immediately bishop attacks the undefended knight, and the knight goes to b6 attacking the bishop in turn, and the bishop returns to b3 having an eye on the f7 square. So bishop to g7 by Fischer, and knight to d2 by Spassky, and castles on the king side Fischer, and h3 by Spassky, now preventing this bishop from coming there to g5 over here. So after that, a5 by Fischer, and immediately a4 is played by Spassky, preventing this pawn from being pushed forward. And after that, d into e5 pawns are now exchanged, and the pawn get taken back, and knight goes to a6. And after that, Spassky also castles on the king side, and Fischer brings his knight to c5. Normally, you don't see like especially players like GM bringing their knights to the edge of the board. Normally, you open it towards the center, and unless it's for special purposes. So he immediately went to c5, attacking that bishop and also attacking this pawn over here. Now there are two attacks, and there's two defense uh, by the bishop and the rook. So now the queen goes to e8, and there is no way to protect that pawn, and you will be losing that pawn. So knight 2 goes to e4. Actually, it's shown as Niagara C. Knight to d4 was shown basically, but instead of that, Fischer goes for the capture with the other knight instead of using this knight, because if this knight captures Fischer's knight, he can just take it back with your own knight. But Spassky goes for the exchange of the bishop, and after that, the knight takes the bishop back, and the rook comes to e1, creating a battery as of the 15th move on the e line, but it's not open yet basically. But knight again retreats to b6, costing Fischer a move, but he is up by a pawn now, and the bishop comes to d2 now, attacking this pawn, trying to get back the pawn. And now Fischer plays a4, which basically ensures that this pawn have uh, two supports, three supports right now. So after that, bishop comes to g5, attacking this pawn over here, this weak e7 pawn, and it was preferred to bring your bishop here, and for the same impact, the position would have been better. H6 by this allows h6 to be played, pushing the bishop back, and bishop to f5 by Fischer, attacking the knight, and immediately g4 by Spassky, attacking the bishop. The bishop goes to e6, and as of now, Fischer is slightly better in this match, and knight to d4, and the bishop goes to c4, attacking the queen with the support of his knight, and queen to d2 by Fischer, and queen to d7 by Spassky, and queen to d7 by Fischer. It was actually suggested to capture this pawn. So if you capture this pawn, the following combination would have happened, so that you will have a better position with your rook in control of this d file basically. But it didn't happen after that. After this, the rook comes to d1, creating a battery on the open d file, and rook to e8 is played, but it was suggested to play this a3 move over here, but didn't happen. So after that, f4 by Spassky, but it was suggested to push the pawn, attacking the bishop, and going for the exchange of this pawn, this passed pawn. So the after that, the bishop goes to d5, attacking this knight, and the knight goes to c5, attacking the queen, and the queen retreats to c8, and queen to c3 by Spassky, and but it was suggested you push this pawn basically, and which would have been a very good move. So after this pawn is pushed, the following combination would have happened, and basically you will get this knight as well basically. So one rook for two pieces. It would be, but Fischer will be slightly better, but still would be an even game. So because Fischer was afraid of this e6 move, he played e6 himself, blocking that push of that e6 pawn by Spassky, and also supporting his bishop further. And after that, king goes to h2, but it was suggested to play the knight to b5 move. The knight to d7 by Fischer. Again, a3 is suggested. So Fischer get this inaccuracy many times, basically for pushing that a3 pawn, and c5 by Fischer attacking the knight. Knight goes to b5, and the queen comes to c6 attacking the knight. Knight again goes to b6, and now Fischer plays this good-looking move where he forces the exchange of the queen. So now because he captures that knight, you're forced to capture back, and after that uh, the queens basically get exchanged in a different manner, and the pawn is here, and now this bishop could come here and create a support for this pawn on the 7th and protecting the pawn on the 6th rank. So to prevent that, the pawn push of f6 is done with the support of the knight, which is also preventing this pawn from being pushed forward. And after that, g5 by Spassky, trying to get those pawns exchanged so that you can bring your bishop here, creating a pressure on the 7th and 8th rank and the 6th rank as well. So after the pawn exchange, Fischer don't go for the capture and just pushes his pawn, preventing the bishop and also opening up the f file for the rooks as well. So the bishop goes to g3 now, supporting that pawn so that you can capture the pawn, and king to f7, and a natural good looking move, but it was suggested to play a3 here. So Fischer actually, I think, got inaccuracies and mistakes 3 or 4 times in this game. So the knight comes to e5 with a check. So the knight captures the knight, and the bishop comes to e5. Now the bishop is supporting this pawn. It could come here and protect this pawn as well, but you could also push this pawn and do the job. So pawn to b5 by Fischer, which is shown as an inaccuracy. You could have placed your rook to d8, and rook to f1 by Spassky. It was suggested that he play h4, creating this nice little pawn structure supporting this pawn, and but then Fischer plays this blunder kind of move basically, but Spassky did not go for the exchange of his bishop for that particular rook, because in some positions bishops are as equal as rooks actually. So that might be the reason Spassky didn't go for it, and even so he just placed his bishop to f6, supporting the other pawn, leaving this pawn undefended. So Fischer now pushes a3 finally, and now the rook comes to f4, and it was suggested that you capture that pawn, but Fischer continues pushing his pawn to a2 now, and c4 by Spassky, trying to create damage this pawn structure. So the bishop captures the pawn. Now, yes, this rook looks like it's supporting the pawn, but you really can't capture if any piece capture this rook, because then the pawn will be queen, and it will be queen as it will be queening. So d7 pushing the pawn, and then the bishop goes to d5, closing the support for that particular rook. But it was suggested that you push e5, and now the king comes to g3, and the rook goes to a3, and now the pawn moved to c3, closing that check with that pawn, and now the rook doubles on h8 and a8, sorry, and after that the rook to h4 by Spassky. So Fischer plays e5, giving space for his king to move up the board, and after the check, the following checks basically, that pawn get captured, and the pawn Fischer gets back the pawn by capturing this undefended pawn from the check, and the king moves to f2, and after that again one more check, and the king goes to e1, and after that Fischer captures the pass pawn on the 7th rank, and now basically Fischer is up by 3 pawns in the game, and he gives up his bishop for that 3 pawns that he obtained, and the king goes to c6, and after the checks the king comes to b7, and then the king slowly moves up the board, and after the rook exchange the king comes to d2, and the pawn push of b4 happens, and here h4 by Spassky, and the king goes up to b5, and again now h5 by Spassky, and c4 is played. So here rook to a1 is played by Spassky not going for the capture of this pawn. So if you go for the capture of this pawn, it will be advantage for Fischer. So because after that, after this check, you will be forced to exchange your bishop for 2 pawns, and after the queening, basically the rook will come in here and he will capture both of these pawns, or at least one of these pawns, and with the help of the king he can capture the other pawn and queen the remaining pawn. So because of that, the pawn was not captured, and now Fischer uses this opportunity to capture that pawn, which allows the passing of this pawn, and Fischer just keep pushing his pawn to h4, and kept pushing his pawn to h3 here. Now bishop to e7, which is shown as a blunder. It was better to place your king to c1, and Fischer brings his rook to g8, and after that bishop to f8, imprisoning this particular rook, because this rook is out of moves. All he can do is capture that bishop, which will result in queening, and it will need the support of the king. But Fischer continues pushing the pawn instead of trying to do anything with the rook, and now the king goes to c2, and the king to c6 was played by Fischer, but b3 was suggested by and to be played here, creating a check. And after that, the rook comes to d1, and the king to b2 was suggested, and now the check happens. And after that, the king comes to c3, trying to attack the undefended back pawn over here, and now it queens. Basically, it was shown as a blunder. It was shown as better to push the f4 pawn, which deflects the rook, forces the rook, and it deflects the rook from there, which brings the king to d5, protecting this pawn. Earlier you couldn't bring your king here because of the rook over here, so that looked like a deflection move. And after that, the king to b2 is played, and the pawn push of f4 happened. The rook comes to d1, and the king moves up the board with the rook to e4 move, and king to d3. But it was suggested to bring your rook here, which would have prevented this king from entering the pawn territory, and because it didn't happen, so the king now moves to e2, closer to that, and after that the pawn push of f3 happens, and now the bishop goes to c5 is played. So it was better to capture that one pawn, and this frees up the rook of Fischer, and he captures that pawn, and now this pawn is captured, and the rook comes to d7, and after the check, the king goes up to the queening square at f1, and the bishop goes to d4, and f2 is played by Fischer, and now it's already all the combination shows it's a checkmate on the board, and at this position Spassky resigns the game, and Fischer won the match, because if you attack this pawn with your rook, Fischer can just go and capture this bishop with his rook, and once the rook captures back, the king moves out of that queening square, and after the check, the king will be in a position, and the rook will be out of check. You'll have to go here, and Fischer queens. Basically, yes, you will lose both of these pawns with a check, and the king can capture, but it will be a rook versus queen endgame, which Fischer will win. So very very hard and challenging match with a lot of combinations, and that might be the reason they had a lot of inaccuracy and blunder in this match. But it happened in 1972, and there was no engines or anything or computers at that time for players to review their matches and position. So very challenging and a difficult game for a world championship match. And thanks very much for watching. A pretty long game, 74 moves to be exact, but it was quite enjoyable, a different kind of chess game. So thanks very much for watching. We'll be back with more such videos.